The blood wouldn't stop. That was the first thing Maren noticed when she pushed through the heavy oak door of the inn's back corridor. The sharp metallic smell of it cutting clean through the warmth of roasting meat and pine smoke, cutting through 4 ordinary years of an ordinary night. She had been carrying a tray of ale mugs toward table 7. That was all. That was the whole of what she'd meant to do with her evening. And now she stood frozen in the narrow passage, her worn boots planted on cold stone, watching 3 men in dark leather drag a 4th through the side entrance with the kind of urgency that only ever means one thing. Someone important was dying. Right there in the back hall of the Copper Kettle, in the town of Marrow's Reach, where nothing important had ever happened in all the years she'd been hiding in it. She pressed herself against the wall to let them pass. The man they carried was enormous. Even slumped between 2 guards, his frame was broad, his shoulders nearly spanning the width of the corridor, his dark head hanging low against his chest. The left side of his tunic, deep charcoal wool, finely stitched. Expensive, in a way nothing in this town was expensive, was soaked black. A 4th guard came behind them, barking orders in a low-clipped voice at a boy who couldn't have been more than 17. Move the tables. Clear the main hall. Send for the healer. Now. Maren flattened herself further against the stone. The tray pressed into her ribs, and she looked for just a moment at the insignia stamped into the guard's chest plates. A wolf mid-howl crowned in iron, and her stomach dropped very quietly, the way a stone drops into a still pond. No splash, just gone. The king's men. She didn't look at the wounded man's face, because in her experience, looking too long at powerful men only ever brought trouble, and she had spent a very long time learning to bring herself as little trouble as a person possibly could. So she kept her eyes down, and she waited for them to pass, already counting in the back of her mind how fast she could get back to table 7 before old Harrow started complaining that his ale had gone warm. Except the boy stopped in front of her. You. His voice cracked on the single word. Just cracked right down the middle, the way a boy's voice does when he's been awake too long and frightened too much. You work here. Maren looked up. Slowly. The boy's face was pale as birch bark. His eyes too wide-rimmed red, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days and wasn't going to sleep tonight either. I serve tables, she said, carefully. Is there a back room, a quiet room? Somewhere clean. She glanced past him, at the man. And up close, the blood loss was worse than she'd thought, or at worse she could see it now, in the way his head hung not quite unconscious, but not quite present either, in the shallow pull of breath through his nose in the gray, creeping up beneath his jaw. She knew that gray. She had seen it before. A long time ago, in a different life, in a small house at the edge of an old wood, on the faces of people who did not always live through the night. The storage room, she said. Second door on the left. The table in there is sturdy. The boy nodded and ran ahead to open it. And she should have gone back to table 7. She knew that. She knew it the way you know the shape of your own hands in the dark. Go back. Refill the ale. Be invisible. Be small. Be exactly the woman you have worked 4 years to become, and not 1 inch more. Instead, her feet moved, because something in the tilt of that man's neck told her they were about to lay him down at the wrong angle. And the wrong angle would open the wound wider, and the wound was already trying to kill him. Stop. The word came to her before she could think better of it, before she could remember all the excellent reasons a woman like her should never make 4 armed men turn around and look at her. But they did. All four of them turned and looked. She set her tray down on a barrel, crossed the small room in 3 steps, and reached past the boy to shift the grain sack someone had already shoved beneath the man's head, lifting it, tilting it just enough to ease the strain off the left side of his throat, where the wound clearly began. Then she stepped back and picked up her tray again, as if none of it had happened, as if she were already halfway back to table 7 in her mind. The largest guard stared at her, a man with a jaw like an anvil and eyes like cold river stone. He stared for a long, long moment. "Who are you?" "Maren. I serve tables." "Why did you do that?" She looked at the angle of the wound, at the faint blue beginning to gather at the man's fingertips like frost creeping up a window pane. "Because the way you had his head," she said, "would have put pressure on the wrong vein, and he'd have been dead before your healer got here." A pause. "That's all." And she turned to leave. The wounded man's hand shot out and closed around her wrist. Maren went very still. The grip was impossibly strong for someone half in the grave. Impossibly certain. She didn't pull away, because she'd learned long ago in that other life that pulling away from a trapped grip only ever tightens it. So she stood, and slowly, she turned back. His eyes were open. They were the color of storm clouds shot through with amber. Not quite gray, not quite gold. Something between the two. Something that seemed to shift as she looked at it. The way light shifts on deep water, when you can't tell how far down it goes. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't name. "Don't go," he said. His voice was low, rough, the texture of gravel under a boot heel, and the whole room had gone so still that she could hear the fire spitting pine resin 2 walls away, could hear the boy breathing, could hear her own heart, doing something it had not done in 4 disciplined years. Maren looked down at her wrist in his hand. She looked back at his face, and she had no idea who he was. None. Only the wolf on his men's armor, and the ruined wool of his tunic, and the way every single person in that room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for him to speak, as if his breath were worth more than all of theirs combined. "I'm a waitress," she told him, very clearly, very calmly. "Not a healer." The corner of his cracked lips moved. It might have been the beginning of something that wasn't quite a smile. "I know," he said, and then his eyes closed again. By the time the healer arrived, Maren had gone back to table 7. She refilled Old Harrow's ale without being asked. She cleared 3 empty bowls from the far corner. She moved through the smoky warmth of the main hall. In the practiced, invisible way she had perfected across 4 years of quiet, efficient, always careful, never to take up more room than a person absolutely had to. She did not think about the man in the storage room. She told herself that twice, which meant, of course, that she thought about him without stopping. The copper kettle sat at the edge of Marrow's Reach, a market town wedged in the valley between 2 mountain ridges, where the wind never quite stopped, and the winter lasted 4 months longer than anywhere, with any sense. It was not a glamorous place for a woman of 24 to spend her days. But Maren had long ago learned to measure her life by something other than glamour. She had a small room above the kitchen, a wool blanket thick enough for the cold, enough coin at week's end to eat properly, and a reputation among the regulars as a woman who did not cause problems. That last one was the most valuable thing she owned. She was refilling the breadbasket at the counter when the argument started in the private hall. She wasn't meant to hear it. The door was nearly shut, but the walls of the copper kettle were old and thin, and Maren had very good ears, a fact she had always kept to herself. "The wound won't close." The healer's voice, high and strained. "Then close it." "I've applied the silver root twice. It should have worked by now. Something in this wound resists the compound. You're the finest healer in 3 provinces. I know what I am." A pause. Cloth rustling. "And I'm telling you, I don't know what this is." Maren set the breadbasket down. She thought about the angle of the wound, the clean edge and the ragged edge. She thought about the blue at his fingertips, that creeping frost. She thought about a woman she had known a very long time ago, not a healer, not officially, never with a title, who had taught her that sometimes the body's refusal to close is not about the wound at all, but about what the wound was made with. She thought about that for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she untied her apron, folded it neatly over the counter, and walked to the private hall. The guard at the door put a hand on her shoulder before she could knock. "Not your business." "I know," Maren agreed. "Is he still bleeding?" The guard's jaw tightened. They let her in. The voice came from inside. That rough gravel voice she'd heard exactly 1 sentence from and somehow already knew. Quieter now, more strained, but still carrying an authority that did not need volume to be obeyed. The guard moved aside. Not happily. Maren walked in. The storage room smelled of iron and pine resin, and the sharp, acrid bite of silver root burning uselessly against skin that would not take it. The healer stood beside the makeshift table, an older man neatly dressed, wearing the look of a competent person meeting something outside his competence for the first time in a long career. He looked at Maren the way you look at unexpected weather, uncertain whether to be relieved or offended. The man on the table had his eyes open again. She crossed the room without asking permission, which she suspected was either exactly the right instinct or a catastrophic mistake, and she supposed she'd find out which. She looked at the wound properly for the first time. Long, clean on one edge, ragged on the other, made by something that started sharp and ended broken. "What did this?" she asked. "That's not the anvil-jawed guard began. "A cursed blade." The man on the table said it quietly. His eyes were on her face. "Ash iron wrap." The healer made a sharp sound. "That's not possible. Ash iron hasn't been forged in—" "I know what cut me." Maren nodded. Slowly, she looked around the room. Grain sacks, oil jars, dried herbs hanging from the low beam in dusty bundles. And her eyes found what she needed in about 10 seconds, because her eyes had been trained long ago to find such things fast, in rooms far worse than this one. She moved to the hanging bundles. Selected 2, moved to the oil shelf, uncorked a small jar, smelled it, put it back. Took the next. "What are you doing?" the healer demanded. "The silver root won't work on an ash iron wound," she said. Not unkindly. "It feeds on compound medicine. The more you apply, the harder it resists." She was already working. Hands moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this in far worse conditions than a warm storage room. "You have to neutralize the curse first. Then the wound closes on its own." Silence. She worked for a minute, perhaps a little less. When she stepped back, the wound had closed. Not healed, it would scar, and the skin around it was still an angry red, but the bleeding had stopped completely. And the blue had already begun to retreat from his fingertips. Color returning in a slow, quiet tide. The healer stared. The guard stared. The man on the table looked at his own hand, the one that had gripped her wrist. And then he looked at Maren with that same unnamed expression from before. 25 healers, the anvil-jawed guard said, and his voice had changed entirely. In 3 kingdoms, for 6 days. Maren set her 2 borrowed herbs back on the shelf where she'd found them. Then they were all using the wrong compound, she said, simply, and she turned to leave. Maren. She stopped. The man on the table, the man whose name she still did not know, whose face she had been so carefully not memorizing, whose grip she could still feel faintly around her wrist, said her name, as though he had already been carrying it around for some time. Sit down, he said. Please. It was the please that stopped her, because in her experience, men who traveled with armed guards and silver insignia and fine charcoal wool did not say please to waitresses in storage rooms. They did not say please to anyone. That was rather the point of being such a man. She turned back around. I still have tables to serve, she said. I know. And something in those storm and amber eyes shifted. I'll wait. She finished her tables. It took another hour. The dinner crowd at the copper kettle didn't thin until the candles on the far wall had burned down to their second mark, and Maren moved through all of it with her usual steadiness, refilling mugs carrying bowls of lamb stew through the smoke-warm hall, nodding at the regulars, who called her by name. Old Harrow finally stopped complaining about his ale. The fire in the great hearth crackled and spat resin into the air. And it was all exactly as it always was, except that there were 2 royal guards standing at the mouth of the private hall. And Maren could feel in that way she had of sensing things, without ever looking straight at them, that the man inside was still awake, still waiting. When she finally untied her apron for the second time that night, Petra leaned over the counter. Petra was the inn's other waitress, a broad-shouldered woman of 30 who had seen everything twice and been surprised by exactly none of it. You know who that is in the back room, don't you? Maren looked at her. The Alpha King, Petra said. Flat, matter of fact, the way she might say the well's gone dry again or frost came early this year. Alaric of Greymark. They say he hasn't been seen in public in 6 days. They say he was dying. A pause. They say he still might be. Maren said nothing. The guard asked Rolf about you. Petra went on, meaning the innkeeper. Your name, your history, how long you've worked here. She tilted her head. Rolf told him 4 years, no trouble good worker. Didn't say much else. Because Rolf doesn't know much else. That's accurate, Maren said. Petra looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression she saved for things she had decided not to push on. Then she hung her apron on the hook by the kitchen door. Be careful, she said, and went upstairs. Maren stood alone at the counter a while. The fire had burned low. The last of the customers were pulling on their cloaks. Outside, the mountain wind pressed against the shuttered windows with a low, persistent sound, like something asking to be let in. She walked to the private hall. He was sitting up. Someone had found him. A clean shirt, undyed linen, borrowed from whatever the inn had slightly too short in the arms and pulling at the shoulders. The ruined charcoal tunic had been folded and set aside, dark stains and all. His feet were on the floor. He was holding a cup of water and looking up at the low beam over the table, as though it had said something worth considering. The anvil-jawed guard. Doran, she had learned his name from Petra, stood in the corner with his arms crossed and his eyes on her, the moment she entered. Not hostile. Evaluating. The way a man evaluates a door he isn't sure should be opened. The boy from the corridor sat on a grain sack near the wall, half asleep, his chin dropping toward his chest. He couldn't have been more than 17, and he had the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in a week. Alaric looked at her when she came in. The storm in his eyes was clearer now, more present. Whatever had been pulling him under before had let go at least for tonight, and what was left was a gaze that was direct and unhurried and faintly unsettling, the way very still water is unsettling. You can't always tell how deep it runs. "You stayed," he said. "You asked me to. People don't always do what I ask." The corner of his mouth moved. That almost thing that wasn't quite a smile. "Even when I say please." Maren pulled a low stool from beside the wall and sat down on it, which seemed to mildly surprise him. She suspected most people either stood at attention or dropped into chairs with elaborate deference. She just sat, hands folded in her lap, back straight. "How does your side feel?" "Better than it did this morning." He set the cup down. "Where did you learn that?" She considered the question. Not whether to answer, she wasn't a secretive person by nature, but how to answer it accurately. "A woman I knew when I was young," she said. She wasn't a trained healer. No title. But she understood plants and wounds and the way a curse sits in the body differently than an honest injury. A pause. "She taught me what she knew." "Who was she?" "She's dead," Maren said. Not coldly, simply. "She died when I was 17. Alaric was quiet a moment. "I'm sorry." "You didn't know her?" "No." His eyes stayed on her face. "But you did." And Maren looked at him steadily, because it was a strange thing for a king to say. Or at least she imagined it was. She had no particular experience with kings. She had experience with men who held power over other people. And in that experience, they rarely acknowledged the weight of small losses, unless the losses were their own. "Your healer," she said, redirecting. He was using the right compound for a normal wound. He couldn't have known it was ash iron. "I know." Alaric's jaw shifted. "He'll be compensated." I wasn't defending him. She tilted her head. "I was explaining. There's a difference." Doran made a small sound from the corner. She wasn't sure if it was disapproval or something else. 25 healers, Alaric said, echoing Doran from before. 6 days, every one of them trained, titled, experienced. He looked at his own hands. Large hands marked with the kind of fine scars across the knuckles that don't come from carelessness, but from long, long practice. And a waitress in a mountain inn solved it in under a minute. "I had the right herbs on the shelf," Maren said, "and I've seen an ash iron wound before. That's not skill, that's circumstance. You knew what to look for." "Yes." "That's skill." He said it quietly. Certain. She didn't argue. She'd learned that arguing with people about their own certainties is usually a waste of everyone's evening. "Why were you on the road?" she asked instead. "The King's Road through Marrow's Reach doesn't go anywhere important. It's a market route, and something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Doran didn't move. The sleeping boy didn't stir. But the air changed the way it changes just before rain, a subtle drop in pressure, a held breath. "I was told it was the safest route," Alaric said. Maren looked at him. "Who told you that?" His expression gave her nothing, but his silence gave her something. A quality of silence that means a question has landed somewhere it wasn't expected to. "My advisor," he said, after a moment. "And where is your advisor now?" Another pause. Longer. "That's a good question," he said, very quietly. She thought about the wound again. The clean edge, and the ragged edge. The deliberate combination of ash and iron, which was not something a person found by accident. You found it by intention. You went looking for it. She thought about 25 trained healers who had all failed, all of them using the same standard treatment. None of them ever told what the weapon had been. She thought about a route through a mountain town that had been called safe, and she kept every bit of it to herself. Because it was not her business. Because she was a waitress who served tables and had a small room above the kitchen, and a life that fit very neatly inside its own careful borders. Borders she had built by hand for reasons she did not care to revisit. "You should sleep," she said, standing. "The wound will hold tonight, but your body needs rest to finish what I started. Don't let anyone put anything else on it. No compounds, no poultices. Just leave it be." Alaric looked up at her from the table. She was standing now, and he was seated, which meant for once she was the taller of the two, and something about that seemed to interest him. "Marin," he said, "I need to ask something of you." She waited. "I need to move through this valley for the next 3 days. There are things here that can't wait." His voice was even, but underneath the evenness she could hear the faint strain of a man who had spent 6 days injured and was not accustomed to being at a disadvantage. "And it appears that whoever arranged this is still somewhere in this valley, which means I may need someone who understands cursed wounds." A pause. "Someone who isn't already part of my circle." The fire in the main hall had gone almost entirely to coals. The wind outside had picked up. Marin could feel the cold coming under the door, threading across the stone floor and around her boots. "You want me to stay close?" she said. "I want you to be available, if needed." "I'm a waitress," she said, for the 3rd time since she'd met him. "I serve tables." "I know what you are." He said it exactly as he'd said it in the corridor, with the same weight, the same quiet certainty. But this time there was something else underneath it. Not quite a question, but the shape of one, as though he knew perfectly well she was more than she was saying and was choosing for now not to press it. "I'll think about it," she said. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the frame when Doran's voice came from the corner. Low, not quite aimed at her, not quite aimed away. "You should know," he said. "The last person who helped him is currently missing." Marin's hand stayed on the frame. She didn't turn around. "I know," she said, and she walked out. She lay awake in her small room above the kitchen for a long time that night, listening to the wind work at the shutters. The wool blanket was thick, the straw mattress familiar under her back. The room smelled of old wood and the faint ghost of kitchen smoke that never fully left the upper floor. She stared at the ceiling. The last person who helped him is currently missing, and she thought about the careful, quiet life she had built. About how 4 years at the Copper Kettle had been just long enough for her to start believing the life she used to live, the one before Marrow's Reach, before the inn, before Petra and Harrow, and the smell of pine smoke, belonged to some other woman entirely. A woman she had left behind on the far side of the mountains and never intended to become again. She thought about the woman who had taught her about cursed wounds, about ash iron, about the quiet, titleless knowledge that had no name and earned no recognition and sat in her 2 hands like something she'd never once asked to carry. She thought about a king who had said please and meant it. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters with that low, persistent sound. Asking. Always asking. She closed her eyes. By morning she had decided. She told Rolf she needed 3 days. The innkeeper looked at her across the kitchen counter with the expression of a man who had long since learned that Maren did not make requests she hadn't already decided on. He was a wide, slow-moving man in his 50s, gray-bearded, with hands like bread loaves, and he had hired her 4 years ago on nothing more than the steadiness of her eyes and the fact that she'd asked for a fair wage rather than a desperate one. In his experience, people who knew their own worth caused fewer problems than people who didn't. 3 days, he repeated. I'll cover a temporary girl from the market, and I'll work double shifts when I'm back. He was quiet a moment. Then he reached under the counter and produced a small cloth bundle. Bread, dried meat, something wrapped in paper that turned out later to be salt cheese. He set it on the counter in front of her. Without a word, Maren picked it up. Thank you, Rolf. Don't get killed, he said, which was the most sentiment she had ever heard the man express in 4 years. And he went back to his bread. The morning was the gray-white of early mountain winter. The sky pressed low and heavy, the air carrying the smell of snow that hadn't come yet. Maren came out into the yard with her bundle and a worn canvas pack over one shoulder, a change of clothes, her herb kit wrapped in oilcloth, a small knife she'd carried for years in a sheath at her belt, mostly out of a habit she'd never quite managed to break. Alaric was standing beside a black horse. He looked different in the morning light. Still large. Still carrying that banked authority that seemed to fill a space whether or not he was doing anything at all. But the borrowed linen was gone, replaced by proper traveling clothes, dark wool, leather, a heavy cloak with a fur-lined collar. The wound on his side was covered. He moved with only the slightest stiffness, the kind a person wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. I was watching the mountains when she came out. He turned when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. His eyes went to her pack, then to her face. You decided, he said. 3 days, she said. Then I go back to my tables. Something moved across his expression. Too quick to name. 3 days, he agreed. Doran appeared from the far side of the horse, wearing the expression of a man with several opinions he was choosing not to voice. He looked at Maren's pack, at her knife, at her general lack of anything resembling a proper healer's kit, and he pressed his mouth into a thin line. She rides with the second group, he said, to Alaric, not to her, behind the main guard. She rides where she can be useful, Alaric said, in a tone that ended the conversation cleanly and without heat. Doran's mouth got slightly thinner. He walked away. Maren looked at the horse. It was a very large horse. She was a competent rider in the way most people from mountain towns are competent, functional, unhurried, unlikely to fall off. But she had not sat anything this size since she'd been a different woman in a different life, on the far side of those ridges. Can you ride? Alaric asked. Yes. Well, she considered. Adequately. He looked at her for a moment. Adequately, he repeated. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Light, brief, gone almost at once like a crack of sun between clouds. He turned back to the horse and adjusted the saddle strap with the ease of long habit. And she watched his hands again, the fine scars, the way he moved, careful, but never slow, always aware of exactly where everything around him was even injured, even in the ordinary act of tightening a strap. There was something in his body that was permanently quietly ready. She looked away and checked her pack instead. They rode out under a low gray sky, 4 guards forward, Alaric at the center, with Doran close 2 guards behind, and Maren on a smaller bay horse that Doran had found for her with the air of a man doing something he found personally offensive. And behind her rode the boy. His name was Ren, she learned. He was 17. He'd been Alaric's page for 8 months, and he had not slept properly. In a week, she could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, in his nervous habit of checking the tree line every few minutes, the habit of someone the last 6 days had frightened badly. He rode up alongside her after the first mile. "You're the waitress," he said. Not unkindly. Conversational. The way of someone who'd been rehearsing how to open a sentence for some time. "Yes," Maren said. "You fixed what 25 healers couldn't." "I had the right information." Ren was quiet a moment, his horse's breath making small clouds in the cold. "The healer's been with the court 12 years, he said. He's treated wolf fever, bone break wounds, poison arrows." A pause. "He cried a little last night, after you left. I don't think he meant for anyone to see." Maren looked at the road ahead. "He shouldn't feel ashamed. Ash iron wounds are rare enough that most healers go a whole career without seeing one. The knowledge just isn't common. Where does the knowledge come from?" And she thought of the woman again. The small house at the edge of the old wood. The smell of dried herbs and tallow candles and old paper. Patient hands guiding her smaller ones. You have to ask the body, Maren. You have to listen. "Old places," she said. "Old teachers." Ren seemed to accept this. He rode in silence for a while, then said quietly, "The advisor who told him the mountain road was safe. His name is Osric. He's been with the court 3 years." Another pause. "He wasn't in his rooms this morning, when they went to find him." Maren kept her face neutral. "I see." "Doran thinks you should know," Ren said, carefully. "He didn't want to tell you himself, because he doesn't entirely trust you yet. But he thought you should know." She glanced at the boy. He had an honest face, the kind that finds deception slightly uncomfortable, even when carrying it out on someone else's orders. "Tell Doran I appreciate the information," she said, "and that I don't trust him yet either. So we're even." Ren blinked. Then unexpectedly he laughed. A real laugh. Sudden and bright and far too loud for the quiet valley road. 3 guards glanced back. Alaric ahead turned slightly. Maren looked straight ahead and said nothing. But something in her chest, the small guarded thing she kept there, the ember she never quite let die and never quite let burn, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. Because for 4 years she had made herself small in the right place at the right pace for the right reasons. Invisible when she needed to be. Careful always. And now she was on a strange horse on a frozen road, riding into the middle of something that had already made one person disappear. And the trouble was the real trouble. The one she would not admit to Petra or to Rolf, or to the cold gray sky pressing down on the pines. The trouble was that some quiet, buried, long, silent part of her had been waiting 4 years for exactly this, for a reason to stop being small. She just hadn't known it was named Alaric. Not yet. They stopped at midday in a sheltered hollow where the road widened and an old stone waymarker stood half-buried in frozen moss. The guards built a small fire. Someone produced travel bread and dried meat, and Maren sat on a fallen log with her salt cheese and watched the tree line the way Ren had been doing all morning, because old habits do not disappear just because you've spent 4 years convincing yourself you don't need them anymore. Alaric sat beside her. Not beside her, as in near the fire. Beside her, specifically. On the same fallen log. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through 2 layers of wool. And the guards noticed, and very carefully did not look, and Maren pretended not to notice that they were very carefully not looking. "Tell me about the woman who taught you," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because I've been trying to understand something since last night." He held a piece of bread in his scarred hands. "Unhurried. 25 healers. 6 days. All of them trained in formal tradition. Guild knowledge. Court medicine." He looked at her. "And the one person who knew the answer learned it from a woman with no title, in what I'm guessing was not a formal setting." "A small house," Maren said, before she'd quite decided to. "At the edge of a wood. When I was 12. How did you come to be there?" She was quiet a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere up the ridge, a branch gave under early frost and fell through the other branches with a slow, cascading sound. "My mother brought me," she said. "She was sick, not with anything a guild healer could touch. The woman in the wood was the only one who knew how." A pause. "She saved my mother, and then she let me stay, because I kept coming back and asking questions, and she said she'd rather teach me than keep chasing me off her doorstep." "She sounds formidable." "She was stubborn," Maren said. "Which is close." Alaric was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. Lower, more careful. "What happened to her?" And Maren looked at the fire. "She knew things," she said, "that made certain people uncomfortable. People with titles. People who preferred that the kind of knowledge she had stayed inside the guild system, where it could be counted, controlled." A pause. "One winter, she was gone. Her house was still there. Her things were still there. She was gone." The word sat between them in the cold air. Alaric said nothing for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice had shifted again, not softer exactly, but heavier, like a stone moved to cover something underneath. "How old were you?" 17. "And then you came to Marrow's Reach." "Not right away," she said. "Not for a while." She looked at her hands. "But eventually, yes." She could feel him watching her profile. She didn't turn. "Maren," he said, "you're going to ask me something." "I won't," she said. "Not yet." A pause. "How do you know?" "Because you've been building toward it since we sat down," she said. "And whatever it is, it's something you've been carrying a lot longer than this conversation." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before. Not uncomfortable, but full. Like a room where someone has just lit a lamp and the light is still settling into the corners. "Fair enough," Alaric said, quietly. He stood brushing the frost from his cloak. For now. They reached the first settlement by late afternoon, a cluster of longhouses and a market square called Thornbury. Arriving just as the light had gone, the pale Achildir of a sun, too tired to warm anything. The smell of wood smoke hung thick in the air. Somewhere ahead, someone was rendering tallow. And beneath both of those smells was something else, something faint and sharp, that Maren caught the instant they rode into the square, and that made her sit up straighter in her saddle, without meaning to. Doran appeared at her left stirrup. "What is it?" She hadn't realized she'd reacted visibly. She looked at him, the anvil jaw, the cold riverstone eyes. Who in this settlement was Osric supposed to meet? Doran went very still. "How did you—" "The smell," she said, simply. "Ash and iron. Very faint, but more recent than the wound." She looked out at the square, the longhouses, the market stalls being folded and covered. Evening, the ordinary faces of ordinary people moving through the end of an ordinary day. "He came through here," Maybe he's still here. Doran looked at Alaric. Alaric was looking at Maren, and in his expression, the storm and the amber, the still water depth of it, she saw the question he had been building toward all day finally rise to the surface. Not spoken, not yet. But there, clear and present and waiting. Who are you? Really? She looked away first. They found Osric's horse behind the tallow-maker's shed at the far end of the square. A pale gray mare with the royal stable brand on her left flank, still saddled, still bridled, her breath coming in anxious clouds. She'd been there long enough that her hooves had stamped the frozen mud into small, uneven ruts, but not so long that she'd stopped turning her head toward the road, waiting for a rider who hadn't come back. Doran sent 2 guards around the back. 2 more took the alley between the longhouses. Alaric dismounted without being asked, which made Doran say his name in a low, sharp tone that suggested this was a very old argument between them, and Alaric looked at him with the patience of a man who had heard the argument many times and still intended to do exactly what he was going to do. Maren dismounted too. Nobody told her to stay back. She suspected that was an oversight she'd hear about later. The tallow-maker's shed was small and warm, and smelled powerfully of rendered fat and wood ash. A man of perhaps 50 stood in the doorway with his hands raised, and pure bewilderment on his round face, while one of the guards questioned him. Low. Fast-clipped. The man kept shaking his head. The horse arrived this morning. Wren relayed a few steps behind Maren, having apparently decided to follow along. A man paid him to keep it. Paid well. Said he'd be back for it by nightfall. Description, Doran demanded. The tallow-maker spoke. Wren passed it along. Medium height, dark cloak. A pause. He says the man's hands were wrapped. Both of them. In linen. And Maren's attention sharpened on that last detail, like a blade drawn across a whetstone. She looked at Alaric, who was standing just inside the doorway, with that still water look she was beginning to understand was not blankness at all, but the opposite. A very full kind of quiet. The kind that meant he was holding several things at once and choosing carefully which one to set down first. Wrapped hands, she said, quietly. Not to anyone. Alaric looked at her. Ash iron leaves a residue, she said. If you handle the weapon without protection, it marks the skin. Doesn't wash off easily. You'd cover it. You'd have to. Can you track him by it? Doran asked. Not track. She considered. But if I see him, I'll know. Doran looked at her. For a long moment. With that evaluating expression, she'd come to recognize the one that was slowly, reluctantly, and clearly, against his own preference, shifting from suspicion toward something more, like grudging respect. He looked at Alaric. Something passed between them without words. Then he walked away to organize the search. Alaric stayed. They stood in the narrow strip of space between the shed and the alley wall, now the cold pressing in from both sides, the last of the pale gold light draining out of the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear over the eastern ridge, faint distant, the cold light of stars seen through mountain air. 3 years, Alaric said. Maren looked at him. Osric has been in my court 3 years. His voice was even, controlled, the evenness of a thing held very firmly in place. Recommended by my second counsel. He came with references. He knew the court's language, its systems. He made himself useful in ways that were always just visible enough to be noticed. A pause. I trusted him. Maren said nothing. Because she had learned that the moments when powerful people admit to being deceived are fragile ones. They don't need commentary. They need to be allowed to exist. "I should have seen it," he said. "People show you what they've prepared to show you," Marin said. Seeing through a prepared performance isn't the same as failing to see. He looked at her with a look she hadn't caught on him before. Something slightly unguarded, a hairline crack in the still water surface. "You sound like a woman who knows something about that." She looked at the first stars. "I know something about most things I talk about," she said. "That's why I'm careful about what I talk about." A silence. Then quietly, "What aren't you telling me, Marin?" And the question landed without weight. Without demand. It was just a question asked in the tone of a man genuinely asking, rather than a man maneuvering toward something. That quality, the genuine rather than the strategic, was the thing about him she had found most disorienting from the very first sentence in the corridor. Because it didn't match what she'd expected, and she hadn't yet recalibrated for it. She turned to face him. I was close in the narrow space, and the warmth coming off him despite the cold was a wolf thing she knew that had known it since the storage room, without letting herself acknowledge it. The banked heat of a shifted nature held under skin. "I'm from a border settlement," she said, "called Ashfield, south of the Second Ridge. I lived there until I was 17. Then the Wood, then Marrow's Reach." She paused. "Ashfield burned when I was 17. The same winter my teacher disappeared." Her voice stayed flat. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt it the way you feel an old break in a bone, dull, permanent, always there when the weather turns. "I came back after, and it was gone. All of it. Ash and stone." Alaric had gone very still. "Ashfield," he said, and something in the way he said it made her look at him sharply. His expression had changed. The hairline crack had widened into something she couldn't immediately name. Recognition. And underneath the recognition, something heavier. Something that looked almost like grief. "You know it," she said. Not a question. "I knew of it," he said, carefully. He looked away from her toward the darkening sky, and for just a moment, she saw what he looked like underneath the authority and the controlled stillness, a man carrying something he had not set down in a very long time. Ashfield fell under old border protection. It came under the Crown's jurisdiction when it burned. "When it burned," she said, "there was an investigation. It was closed." His jaw shifted. "The fire was 5 years gone by the time I took the throne. The file was already shut, already ruled an accident, a lamp, a dry winter, a settlement gone up in the cold. And then 2 years ago questions came across my desk. Things that didn't fit a common fire. I could have reopened it." He stopped. "I had 30 other crises pulling at me. I was newly crowned. I was tired. And I told myself it was old and cold and done." He stopped again. "I let it stay closed when I could have opened it. I chose not to." The cold between them changed texture. It was no longer just weather. "You let it stay closed," Marin said. "Yes." The word was quiet, and it carried its own full weight. "I let it stay closed." She breathed in and out. The smell of tallow and wood smoke and frozen earth, because she had not expected this. She had ridden 3 days into the middle of a king's private disaster, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she had understood she might find things she'd rather not, but she had not expected to stand in a freezing alley in Thornbury and hear the Alpha King himself tell her that the burning of her home had been something he'd had the power to question, and had chosen with 30 other things on his plate not to. She had carried that fire in the back of her chest for years, like an ember that never quite went out. She had built her whole quiet life in Marrow's reach around it, partly because she had no answers, and partly because she had understood in the way you understand things you would rather not, that asking the wrong questions in the wrong direction could make a person disappear. The way her teacher had disappeared. The way Osric's trail was trying right now to make people disappear. "Marin," Alaric said. "Don't," she said, not angrily, just clearly. He was quiet. "Not tonight," she said. "I need to think." He nodded once, slowly. "All right." She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the horses, and she did not let a single thing she was feeling show in her shoulders or her stride, because she was very good at that, and she needed to be very good at that, right now. They stayed the night in Thornberry's only inn, a low-ceilinged place that smelled of straw and old ale, and was considerably humbler than the copper kettle, which Marin found mildly, unreasonably gratifying, in a way she couldn't quite justify to herself. She was given a room that was mostly a closet with a cot in it, which suited her fine. Wren got the room beside hers, and she could hear him turning over and over on his creaking mattress for the better part of an hour before he finally went still. She did not sleep at all. She lay on her back in the dark, and let herself feel carefully in controlled measure the thing she'd been holding at arm's length since the alley. Not betrayal, because he hadn't owed her anything. He hadn't known her. He'd been a newly crowned king with 30 crises pulling at his sleeves. She understood all of that, intellectually, and her feelings had never once in her whole life been especially interested in what she understood intellectually. The ember was still there. It was always there. She held it the way you hold a coal you've decided neither to feed nor to smother, until she heard the sound. Faint, below her window. A footstep trying very hard not to be a footstep, on frozen ground. And she was at the window in 4 seconds, without making a sound, because old habits, as she had already established, do not disappear just because you try to leave them on the far side of a mountain. She looked through the gap in the shutter. In the strip of moonlight between the inn and the stable, a figure in a dark cloak was moving with purpose, toward Alaric's ground-floor window, both hands wrapped in white linen. Marin had her boots on and was in the corridor in the time it took to breathe twice. She did not shout, because shouting wakes everyone, causes panic, gives a prepared person exactly the seconds they need to recalibrate. Instead, she moved fast and quiet down the back stair through the side door, around the corner of the inn, into the cold dark, her breath tight, and controlled the small knife at her belt, suddenly present in her awareness, in a way it had not been in 4 years. She came around the corner of the stable at the exact moment the figure reached Alaric's shutter. "Don't." The figure froze. In the moonlight she could see what he was holding. Not a blade. A small clay vial. The kind used for contact poison. The kind you didn't have to open. You only had to touch it to skin. To a wound. To the wound she had closed the night before above his ribs, the one that looked healed now, the one nobody would think to check. Clever, patient, cold. The figure turned. She had expected Osric to look like a villain, because the mind does that afterward. It insists there must have been signs, a cruelty in the face, a coldness in the eyes. something. But the face that turned toward her in the moonlight was ordinary, tired, middle-aged, the face of a man who had made a series of small decisions and arrived through all of them at a place he might never have meant to end up. "You're a waitress," Osric said. His voice was almost confused. "You're nobody. Step away from the window." He moved instead. Toward her, fast the vial still in his wrapped hand reaching for her wrist. And Marin sidestepped, the way the woman in the wood had taught her in the long-ago summers she never spoke about, putting her weight into the stone wall, letting his own momentum carry him past her. And then Doran was there, because Doran, it turned out, had not been sleeping either, with 2 guards behind him. And Osric was face down in the frozen mud, with his arms pinned before the vial had even finished rolling across the cobblestones. Marin picked it up, carefully, by the base, not the top. Alaric was in the doorway. He'd come out at the sound, his cloak pulled hasty over his shoulders, his eyes finding her first, finding Marin. First before the scene, before Osric, before the vial, and then moving to take in the rest of it. And his expression went through several things very quickly and settled on something controlled and very cold. Doran looked up from where he had Osric pinned. He looked at Marin, at the vial in her steady hand, then back at Alaric. "She was awake," Doran said, in the tone of a man updating a very important file in his mind. "She heard him before any of us did." "Yes," Alaric said. His eyes were on Marin. "She did." And Osric made a sound from the frozen ground that was almost a laugh. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I'm not the end of this. I'm not even the beginning." His voice was tired and flat and worn all the way down. "The order was placed long before you rode out of Greymark, my lord." He said the title with a flatness that stripped it of every ounce of its weight. "There are people in your court who want you gone. People who were there before you, and will be there after." "Who?" Doran demanded. But Osric's muddy, exhausted eyes had moved. To Marin. "Ask her," he said. The yard went very quiet. "Ask her about Ashfield. Ask her who gave the order to burn it." His voice dropped, softer now, almost gentle, which was somehow the worst part of it. "Ask her why the woman in the wood had to disappear." A breath. "Ask her how deep this goes." The cold was total. Somewhere on the ridge above the settlement, a night bird called once, and went silent. And Marin stood there with the vial cradled in her 2 hands, and felt every pair of eyes in that frozen yard turn toward her. Ren half-dressed in the doorway. The 2 guards, Doran and Alaric. She met his gaze. Storm and amber, the still-water depth of it, and she understood in that moment, with a clarity that comes only in the cold and the dark and the middle of the night, that the borders she had built so carefully over so many years, brick by patient, brick had just been breached, not by an enemy, not by a blade, but by a tired man in the mud saying out loud the one thing she had spent 7 years never saying to anyone, that her home had not simply burned, that someone had burned it, and that she had always, always known. "I think," she said, very calmly, very quietly, every word set down with the care of a woman placing a full cup on an uneven table, "that we need to have that conversation now." They sat in the inn's common room with the fire rebuilt and the doors closed. Doran stood by the entrance. Ren had been sent back to his room not unkindly but firmly, in the way you send a person away, when what's about to be said is not something a 17-year-old should have to carry the rest of his life. Osric was secured in the stable under guard, the clay vial wrapped in oilcloth and locked in Doran's travel chest. Outside, the wind had come down off the ridge and was moving through the settlement in long, low sweeps, pressing against the shutters with that persistent asking sound Maren had been hearing since the copper kettle. Since before the copper kettle. Since most of her life, if she was honest about it. And she was trying tonight to be honest about it. She sat across the fire from Alaric, and she told him. Not because Osric had forced her hand, though he had, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it, but because standing in that yard with the vial in her hands, and the cold on her face, and his eyes finding her first in the dark, she had felt something shift inside her, the way ice shifts on a river in early spring. Not breaking, just moving, just beginning to admit that the thaw was already underway, whether she managed it or not. She told him about Ashfield, the real Ashfield, not the border settlement that had burned in an inconclusive fire, but the community underneath that description, a place that had kept old knowledge alive, traditions of healing that predated the guild system by 200 years. Not magic, not in the dramatic sense, just knowledge. Passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, teacher to student, across more generations than anyone could count. Knowledge the guilds had spent 40 years trying to absorb or erase. Because knowledge outside their system was knowledge they could not tax, could not license, could not control. She told him about the woman in the wood, whose name had been Isolde, and who had not vanished by accident, who had been quietly erased because she was teaching, because she had students, because the old network was still somehow alive, and someone had decided it needed to end. She told him that Isolde had left her something, before she disappeared. Not an object, a name, written on a scrap of paper that Maren had memorized and then burned, because Isolde had taught her that paper can be found, and memory cannot be taken by force. Alaric sat very still through all of it. The fire moved in the hearth. The wind moved outside. He sat with his elbows on his knees, and his scarred hands loosely linked, and his face doing that thing she had finally come to understand. Not blankness, but fullness. Holding far more than it showed. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "You've known this," he said, "or suspected it. For how long?" "The name since I was 17, she said. "The shape of it, how far it reached, how high it went, I've been piecing that together, far longer than I've been at the copper kettle." "You came to Marrow's Reach on purpose." "It's close to the second ridge," she said. "Close to Ashfield. I thought if I kept myself small and unremarkable in the right place, eventually the shape would become clear enough to do something about." She looked at her hands. A woman alone with a name and a dead teacher is not a credible source. She's a story, and stories disappear. You were waiting. I was waiting until I had enough. Alaric looked at her for a long, long moment. "You were never just waiting," he said, slowly. "You were protecting yourself, until you could do something that would actually land." She said nothing. "That's not waiting," he said. "That's strategy." And still she said nothing, because there was nothing to add. And because for the first time in 7 years, someone had looked at the shape of her whole careful hidden patient life, and named it correctly. "The name," Alaric said, gently as a man like him could manage. "You said Isolde left you a name." Maren looked into the fire. and then she gave it to him. "It isn't Osric," she said. "Osric is a courier, a tool, a man who fell into debt to someone powerful and agreed to a series of small, manageable-seeming tasks that added up over 3 years into a shape he probably didn't recognize until he was already standing inside it." A pause. "The name Isolde left me is from your own counsel." The fire cracked. "A woman named Sabine," and she watched it land on him like a stone dropped into deep water. He did not shout. Because he was not a shouting man, she'd understood that much by now. He simply went very still in a way that was somehow louder than any shout could have been. The stillness of a man reviewing 10 years of his own life from the inside and finding a thread running through all of it that he had never once thought to pull. "Sabine sat on the second council when Ashfield was closed," Marin said. "She's since risen to the first. She's turned up quietly in 3 kingdoms' worth of negotiations. Her signature is on guild charter expansions in 6 provinces. And 3 years ago, she personally recommended a courier named Osric to your court." "Sabine," he said. "Yes. She held my hand at my coronation." A pause. His jaw shifted. "She wept." "People weep," Marin said, "at the funerals of the men they've helped to bury. They rode for Greymark at first light, not the whole party. Alaric left half the guard in Thornbury with Osric to bring him back under separate escort, because a man who has confessed once will sometimes confess again, and because the thing they were riding toward could not wait for a slow prisoner. He sent word ahead to Rolf too, that Marin would be gone longer than 3 days, with coin enough to cover the temporary girl twice over. It was a small thing, but Marin noticed it. She noticed that he noticed. He took Doran. He took Wren, who had begged and whom nobody had the heart to leave. And he took Marin, who sat her borrowed bay a little straighter that morning, and did not look back at the mountains. Because the borders were behind her now. She had said the name out loud, and there is no unsaying a name. They reached the Iron Vale, the seat of Greymark, the great grey keep on the lowland rise on the 4th day, when the pines had given way to rolling fields, and the air had changed from cold pine to something older and earthier. And Marin, riding through the open gates, felt very small in a way she hadn't in years. Not the small of hiding, the small of standing at the foot of something vast, and choosing to go in anyway. Sabine was waiting in the great hall. Of course she was. Because a woman who has built a life on knowing things before other people do, does not fail to know when her king rides home early with a stranger at his side. And she came down the long stone steps to meet them, with her arms open and her face arranged into perfect, practiced relief. She was handsome. Silver-haired, straight-backed, elegant in the effortless way of a woman who has spent 40 years in rooms where elegance is a weapon. And when she smiled at Alaric, it reached her eyes, which was the most frightening thing about her, because Marin had seen a great many liars in her life, and the good ones always smile with their eyes. "My lord," Sabine's voice was warm, "we heard you were injured. We feared the worst. Thank every old god you're Sabine." Just the name. And something in how he said it stopped her 3 steps up. She looked at him. And then slowly, carefully, she looked at Marin, and Marin watched it happen. The recognition, not of a face because they had never met, but of a kind. A type of person Sabine had spent 3 decades making disappear. She watched the older woman's eyes move over her plain wool dress, her chapped hands, her canvas pack, and file her instantly wrongly, fatally, as nobody, as a story, as a thing that could be made to vanish, which was exactly the mistake everyone made. "Who is this?" Sabine asked, lightly. "She's the reason I'm alive," Alaric said. "How fortunate." The smile didn't waver. "A healer." "A waitress," Marin said, and she watched something flicker deep behind Sabine's composed face. Because Sabine knew that word. Sabine knew where such words came from. The small towns, the border settlements, the quiet places where women with no titles kept knowledge alive in their two hands. She knew, and she smiled wider to cover the knowing, and Marin saw all of it, because Marin had spent her whole life learning to see the things people worked hardest to cover. It should have ended there, in the hall, with a name and a witness and a confession waiting in a cart 4 days behind them. Except Doran turned and drew his blade and put it to Alaric's throat. The hall went silent. Marin's heart stopped. She felt it stop because Doran of the anvil jaw and the cold river eyes, Doran, who had stood between her and every doorway for a week. Doran, who had begun only nights ago to look at her with something like respect. Doran had his sword against the throat of the man he had sworn his life to, and his hand was shaking. Doran. Alaric didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice was terribly, dangerously calm. "What is this?" "She has my sister." Doran's voice broke on the word sister. Just broke clean through the way Ren's voice had broken in the corridor on the first night, and something in Marin's chest cracked to hear it. 3 months. She took her 3 months ago. And she said his jaw worked. She said if I didn't when the time came. "Put it down," Marin said, quietly. Not to Alaric. To Dora, and every eye in the hall came to her. "You're not a traitor," she said. "A traitor chooses. You didn't choose. She chose for you. The day she took someone you love and turned them into a rope around your neck." She took one slow step toward him, her hands open at her sides. "I know exactly what that feels like. To carry a thing you never asked to carry. To do the wrong thing for the right reason in the dark, where no one can see you weeping." Another step. Your sister is alive because you're useful. Which means the moment you use that blade, she stops being useful, and you know it. That's why your hand is shaking. The hall held its breath. Doran looked at her, his eyes wet, his whole life balanced on the edge of the blade in his hand. "Put it down," Marin said, gentler now. "And we'll go get her. Together. I promise you that." And Doran, the largest, hardest, most immovable man Haran had ever met, made a sound like something breaking loose after years frozen in place, and lowered the sword, and turned it, and in one motion crossed the space between himself and Sabine, and put the point of it against her heart instead. "Where is she?" he said. Sabine's composure finally cracked. Not much, just a hairline, just enough. Because she had built her entire architecture on the certainty that the people she owned would stay owned. That fear once planted holds forever. That a woman with no title is nobody, and a courier is a tool, and a broken man is a leash. And she had just watched all 3 of those certainties fail her at once. In under a minute. In her own hall. Guards moved. Alaric's guards, the true ones, closing in from the edges of the room. And Sabine stood very straight in the center of it, with a sword at her heart, and looked not at Doran, not at Alaric, but at Marin. "You're from Ashfield," she said. "Yes. I gave the order." No fear in it now. Only a cold, exhausted honesty, the honesty of someone who has run out of room to lie. The fire, 40 families, the old woman in the wood, and everyone she'd taught and everyone they might have taught after. A pause. It was untidy knowledge, loose in the world, outside the ledger. It made the guilds nervous, and nervous guilds are expensive, and I have spent my whole life making things tidy. Her eyes held Marin's. "You want me to be sorry?" "No," Marin said, and it surprised even her how steady it came out. "I don't want you sorry. Sorry is small. Sorry is a thing you'd say to make yourself feel lighter." She stepped closer. Close enough to see the fine lines around the older woman's eyes, the silver at her temples, the ordinary tired humanity that villainy never quite manages to erase. "I want you to know that you failed. You burned Ashfield to make the knowledge disappear. And here I am, standing in the Iron Veil, alive, knowing every single thing you tried to burn." A breath. "You didn't end it. You just made sure I'd never stop." Sabine looked at her for a long moment. And whatever she saw in Marin's face, some old unbroken thing, some ember that 40 families' worth of ash had never quite managed to smother, made her look away first. Which Marin noticed. Because Marin always noticed who looked away first. They found Doran's sister in a keep 2 provinces east, alive. Thin and frightened and furious, in the particular way of a person who has been used as leverage against someone she loves, but alive. And Doran, who had ridden the whole distance without sleeping, went down on his knees in the dirt of that courtyard when they brought her out and held her, and did not care who saw. Marin watched from the edge of it, and thought about all the ways a person can be broken, and all the ways a person can, against every expectation, be put back together. The investigation began within the week, and Sabine did not go quietly. Exactly, women who have spent 40 years in power rarely do. But she went, stripped of her seat, her papers seized before she understood which direction the questions were coming from. Osric, brought in from Thornbury under heavy guard, talked in the end. Not easily, not quickly. But he talked because the people he'd been protecting had never once protected him, and because the alternative was worse. He confirmed all of it. The network of guild-backed pressure that had operated in the court for a decade. The 3 guild masters who had wanted the old knowledge communities eliminated and routed the commission through court channels to keep their own names clean. The order to burn Ashfield. And the truth about Isolde, that she had not simply vanished into a winter night, that she had been taken, that she had died in the end, refusing to hand over the names of her students. Marin did not testify with a title. She had no interest in titles. She testified as what she was, a woman from Ashfield, one of the last who had learned the old knowledge from the last teacher of it, and who had spent 7 years quietly gathering the truth, because she understood that the truth spoken by the wrong person at the wrong time disappears. She spoke plainly. She spoke slowly. She named names and gave dates, and did not raise her voice once. And they believed her, which was in the end the thing she had waited 7 years for. Not revenge, not even justice exactly, because justice, she had learned, is smaller and messier than grief imagines it will be. But this, to be believed, to have the shape of the truth pass out of her 2 hands and into the world where it could not be quietly closed again by someone in a position of convenient authority. The 3 guild masters faced formal charges. The investigation into Ashfield was reopened and given a dedicated commissioner. And the surviving members of the old knowledge community, there were more of them than Marin had ever known, scattered across border settlements and small towns. Quietly keeping what they kept, were contacted and given formal protected status under a new provision in the territorial charter. It was not everything. It was not justice in the complete, clean sense grief sometimes dreams justice can be. But it was real, and it was written down, and it could not be undone by a signature in a dim room. And that night, the last of the testimony was given, when the great business of it was finally mercifully done, Maren sat alone in a borrowed room in the Iron Vale and let herself grieve Isolde properly, for the first time. Not the fragmented grief of not knowing gone, maybe somehow, but the whole grief of knowing. It was heavier and cleaner. It had edges. It had a shape, and things with shapes can eventually be carried, rather than simply endured. She cried for a while, and then she stopped. And then she slept better than she had in 7 years. She went home to the upper kettle after that, because there were tables that needed covering, and a temporary girl who could not stay forever, and because some part of her needed to stand once more in the life she'd built now that she finally understood what she'd built it to survive. She stayed the winter. She refilled Harrow's ale. She carried lamb stew through the smoke-warm hall. And the letters came in envelopes bearing the Iron Vale seal, most of them in Wren's earnest, honest hand, with his small observations about the weather and what the horses were doing. She read each one at the kitchen counter with her morning tea, and she wrote back precise and factual, and gave Rolf no hint of their contents. And she kept them in a small wooden box under her cot beside the oilcloth herb kit. The last letter came in early spring, when the snow on the ridge had begun to recede and the pines were releasing their cold green smell into air that was tentatively finally beginning to warm. It was longer than the others, and it was not from Wren. It was from Alaric. I was not a man who used more words than a thing required. She'd learned that, too. He wrote that the final report had been published, that the protected status provision was signed and in effect, that Sabine had been stripped of everything and would not trouble anyone again, that this particular thread was closed. And then at the bottom of the page in slightly different handwriting, as though it had been added separately after some consideration, he wrote, I find that I think about a conversation in an alley in Thornbury more often than is probably efficient. If you're willing, I'd like to finish it. There's no obligation in this. There's no expectation. There's only the question, which I think you already know, and which I'd like to ask you properly. Whenever you're ready. Or never if that's what you decide. And I mean that. She read it 4 times. Then she set it down, and drank her tea, and looked out the kitchen window at the pale spring sky above the ridge, and thought about the careful, quiet life she'd built, about how she'd built it to survive, and how surviving, she had come to understand, is not the same thing as living, a distinction she'd been aware of for a very long time, and had mostly been too tired to do anything about. She thought about Storm and Amber Eyes, about a man who said please and meant it, about a scarred hand around her wrist in a lamplit storage room, and a gravel voice carrying her name, as though it had been waiting somewhere a long time to be spoken aloud. She thought about Isolde, who had taught her to listen to what the body already knows. She thought about the ember in her chest. Still there. It would probably always be there in some form, but smaller now, and warmer than it was burning, and surrounded at last by enough clear air that it no longer crowded out everything else. She went to find Rolf, and she told him she needed a leave of absence. She didn't know how long. Rolf looked at her across the flour-dusted counter with the same look as always, unhurried, unflappable, a man long at peace with the fact that the world moves whether he manages it or not. Then he reached under the counter and produced a small cloth bundle. Bread, dried meat, salt cheese. "Rolf," she said. "Don't get killed," he said, and went back to his bread. Petra, listening from the doorway, met Marin's eyes across the kitchen and said nothing at all. Just lifted her chin, the gesture that meant good, and it's about time, and be careful all at once, all in one motion. Marin nodded back. She packed her canvas bag, the change of clothes, the oilcloth herb kit, the small wooden box of letters, the knife in its sheath, and she paused at the door of her room and looked back at it one last time. The narrow cot, the wool blanket, the shuttered window, the smell of old wood and kitchen smoke. 4 years. It had been a good room. It had been exactly what she needed when she needed it. Which was, she had come to understand, worth something, even when what you need is small and quiet, and carefully bordered. She closed the door. She reached the Iron Vale on the 4th day of travel, and Wren was waiting in the courtyard with 2 horses and a wide, helpless smile. The smile of a young man, handed good news and failing entirely to contain it. He'd slept since she'd last seen him. It showed. He looked like a different person, or the same person with the fear taken out, which amounted more or less to the same thing. "He's in the East Hall," Wren said. "He's been there since this morning." A pause. "He arrived early. He knows I'm coming. He knew before you reached the outer road." Wren said it with the slight awkwardness of a boy, referencing a wolf sense he wasn't quite sure how to explain politely. "He's been..." Another pause. "Patient. Very patient." She almost smiled. She handed her reins to Wren and walked to the East Hall. Alaric was standing at the window when she came in. The room was large and warm. A fire in the stone hearth, the smell of wood and old paper, and beneath it, faint that specific scent she had catalogued in a storage room a season ago and had not in all the month since been quite able to put out of her mind. He turned when he heard her step. He looked the same. Broader somehow in a room with a proper ceiling. The storm and amber finding her at once, and staying there, with that fullness, that still water depth, running down to wherever. Still water runs. He did not say you came. It would have been the obvious thing. And he didn't say it. Which was, she thought, exactly why she'd made the journey. "You wanted to finish a conversation," she said. "I did." He crossed the room, slowly, and stopped at a distance that was respectful and present at the same time, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. That wolf heat banked under skin. "You already know the question," he said. "Ask it properly," she said. "You said you wanted to ask it properly." Something moved in his face, the hairline crack, the almost smile wider now, more certain, less almost. "Will you stay?" he asked. Simple, direct. No architecture around it. No qualification, no careful political framing. Just the question offered with both open hands, with no demand hidden inside it, and no performance of a certainty he didn't have. Not permanently, if that's not what you want. Not on any terms but your own. But a breath. "Will you stay?" And Marin looked at him. She looked at the room, the fire, the window with its view of the open lowland distance beyond the walls. She thought of Isolde, who had taught her to listen to what the body already knows, and of what comes after surviving. "Yes," she said. The word was simple, and complete, and final in the way that true things are final, not closed, but settled, the way a stone settles into earth, fitting its own shape into the ground that had been waiting all along to receive it. Alaric let out a long breath. Not a dramatic thing, not a sweep or a declaration, just the breath of a man who had been holding something very carefully for a very long time and had now quietly set it down. He offered his hand. The scarred one, the fine marks across the knuckles from long practice. And she took it. She did not become a healer with a title. She had no interest in titles. She did eventually begin teaching. Small groups in a room in the East Wing that Alaric set aside for it, without being asked, because he had been paying attention, and paying attention was she had come to understand the truest thing he knew how to do. She taught what Isolde had taught her, and what her own 7 years of watching had added to it. And she taught it the way Isolde had patiently, practically, without mystery or ceremony, to anyone who showed up at the door and asked a question and kept coming back. The old knowledge community, those who had survived, scattered and careful keeping what they knew, in memory and in motion, began slowly to come together. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of things that have been underground a long time when the conditions finally change, steadily, toward the light. Ren showed up at the door in the 2nd month. He was a poor student at first, and became a good one, which was more or less what Marin had expected. Doran never came to the room, but at some point, she couldn't quite identify. He simply stopped standing between her and wherever she was going, which was the closest thing to an apology she ever expected from him. And she found it entirely, completely sufficient. The ember in Marin's chest did not disappear. She had stopped expecting it to. Grief, she had learned, does not resolve into nothing. It resolves into something smaller, something you can hold, rather than something that holds you. And that was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. In late summer, when the valley below the Iron Veil was golden green, and the air smelled of warm grass and coming rain, Alaric found her in the East Wing room after her students had gone. Sitting at the table, the oilcloth herb kit open in front of her, a sheet of paper covered in her small, precise hand. She was writing it down, systematically, thoroughly, in language clear enough to be learned from without her in the room. Isolde did this, she said, without looking up. Wrote it down, left records. That's part of why she was dangerous to them. A pause, her pen moving. So I'm doing it again. Better this time. More copies, more hands, so that no one can ever burn it out of the world with a single fire. He crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers, and looked at the page, and said nothing, because he had learned from a waitress in a mountain inn that some silences are fuller than any words a man could put in them. She kept writing. He stayed. Outside, the summer light moved across the valley in long gold sweeps, and the grass bent in a wind that smelled of coming rain, and the world was not fixed. It is never entirely fixed, but it was changed, and changing still, in the slow, permanent way of things that have shifted at their very roots. The woman who had served tables in a mountain inn and carried old knowledge in her 2 hands and an ember in her chest had found, without ever quite meaning to what comes after surviving. She kept writing. He stayed. The light moved across the valley. And that, in the end, was how it settled. Not with a proclamation, not with a grand gesture, but with 2 people in a warm room, and work worth doing, and the quiet of a life that had finally, honestly, at long last, become their own.